In this video, I'm going to show you a cheap, easy and fast metal coating solution for small metal parts, including bolts, because sometimes paint and powder coat isn't really the best option, especially for bolts, because as soon as you do them up, they chip and the paint comes off and then the rust comes through. As always, let's get into it. And stick around to the end of the video because I'm also going to show you how you can brass coat bolts really easily, and it looks so damn cool. I think this is a fantastic option for coating bolts, especially because if you got to take the rust off the bolts, then you're left with a bare bolt. You need to put something on it. And if you use paint, you're probably going to take the paint off as soon as you go to put that bolt back in again and tighten it back up with a socket or a spanner. Just make sure you clean everything really well with acetone and then don't touch it afterwards. So this option is hardy, it's fast, it's cheap, and it just works, and you don't have to worry about the actual coating coming off when you do them up. There are a lot of bolts on bikes which are OEM, they're specially made. You can't actually go down to a bolt store and buy the exact same one. There might be a different head or a different style. This, you probably have all the gear sitting at home right now to do it. I'll show you the comparison between all of them at the end. And if you don't have a blowtorch like this, you can still use something like your gas burning stove if you have one at home, or a barbecue, or even a camp cooker. For the first attempt, I didn't actually worry about checking the temperature. I just waited till it went blue and then threw it straight in the oil. So this is the vegetable oil. I think it's okay, but it's definitely not super dark. It seems to have worked, but only a little bit. So let's try actually getting the temperature to 300 to 400 C and then see what happens. It really didn't make that much difference, I don't think. Next up, let's try WD-40. I tend to buy WD-40 in bulk like this, and just get an old spray bottle and fill it up. It just works out a lot better for me because I go through a lot of it. It's the same procedure. We're just heating up the metal to about 300 to 400, and then we're going to, rather than dip it, we're going to spray it. So that actually worked out pretty cool. I think the more consistent you are with the heat, the better the result you'll have. Actually a really cool pattern if that's something that you're after. However, I don't know if it's the heat that's causing it to do this or if it's just because I'm spraying it on. So let's eliminate one problem. And I'll put some WD-40 in there and we'll dip it. I really don't think it's much better, but when I dropped it in the oil, you could see it went from the sides and just worked its way into the center as it was cooling down, and that caused that little hot spot in the center there. This was the first attempt with the WD-40. I think it's okay, and that was the second one. Next up, let's try some boiled linseed oil. I know this one works quite well because I've used it a few times myself. That one's probably the most consistent yet, but I think that was to do with my heating process. I started working like this and working my way down rather than doing circles and just kind of random patterns. So the next one, rather than using heat, I'm just going to try some of this rust guard that you can get from most automotive places. So this is the rust guard on the mild steel. It really doesn't do anything but get rid of the rust and leave you with a bit of a hazy finish that you can paint over. So let's try a different type of oil this time, something a little bit darker in color, and I know exactly where to get that from. The black CB750 engine oil didn't really make this much darker than the other ones. I feel like it's got something to do with more the heat than it has the oil to make it dark. The linseed oil as well as the WD-40 seems to give it the darkest blue color, and it's not that consistent, but we'll try it on a couple of bolts and see what happens. If you don't have the wire brush on a grinder like I do and you want to clean these bolts up, you can simply do it with one of these guys on your drill or the old trusty wire brush and just put that in a vise and off you go. I highly recommend using a full face whenever you're using any of these wire brush attachments in anything that spins, because those little suckers come out and trust me, they hurt when they hit you in the face. Once again, always use acetone to clean. I'd be extremely reluctant to actually heat these bolts up until they glow red. The main reason is because you're changing the structure of the steel. From the quenching process and heating process, you could make the steel a lot harder, but it will also make it a lot more brittle. And that could be for any kind of hot bluing. So just be selective with what you decide to do. If it's a high tensile bolt and it needs to be torqued down, probably don't hot blue it. You could, but just be super careful with how you do it. And you could also do cold bluing as well. That's another option. Cold bluing is just a bottle that you can purchase and you just paint it straight on. It works really well, but it doesn't have the same properties of the rust preventative as the hot bluing. You will have to probably put oil on it afterwards. When you get it to glow cherry red and you quench it, it generally ends up pretty black. And I'm not too sure what happened here, and there's another spot here, so I might clean that off and try that again and see if we can get that completely black. Yeah, that's much better, as you can see. I sanded this with 120 grit sandpaper just to get a bit of a texture on there. Let's try it with the WD-40 and see if we can get that pattern to come through. It's hard to see with the camera, but it's got like a couple of different shades of blue that are going through it. I really like that. It'd be really cool because it's all in one direction when I sanded it, but that would be really hard to do on some parts, especially awkward shapes. So it's great, but I think sandblasting would be a better option if you were to try and get a consistent, even finish over an entire part that's an odd shape. If you're curious to see if this actually works on stainless, I made a whole headlight bracket out of stainless. If you could get the entire thing at the same temperature, that would be pretty cool, because then you could just dip it in something and it would stay that. Well, I would say it does work. It's kind of really a pointless procedure considering stainless isn't going to rust anyway. But if you wanted it to go a little bit of a darker color, definitely does work. So here's a perfect example of something you could do. This bracket already exists. Rather than trying to make a new one, we could clean this up with a wire brush, but I'm going to do something a little bit different here. I'm going to put it in the Vapor Blaster, blast it, get a bit of a texture to it if I can, and then hopefully you'll see that texture come through the bluing. And when it comes to the horn, you could wire brush this and paint it if you wanted to, but it's so damn cheap to buy a horn, I'd probably just get a brand new one. Another coating option for you is if you can get it to that blue color that you like, let it cool down and then put a clear coat on it and it locks it in and it looks really cool. This is a pretty permanent solution, but just like zinc and nickel plating, it does work for a period of time, but eventually over like 20, 30, 40 years, rust finds a way through. So the sand media that I'm using in my Vapor Blasting cabinet doesn't really leave much of a texture, but you can still see some of the pitting from where the rust was, but apart from that, it's pretty damn cool. I also have this little guy here. It's made of metal. I'm pretty sure it was the clutch or throttle cable guide to go through those holes. Anyway, let's clean it up and see if we can hot blue it. When it comes to the brass coating, you need to make sure you get the right brass brush. I bought these both from my local hardware store called Bunnings here in Australia. This one with the orange handle is the right one, and it actually is 100% brass, whereas this is just brass coated and it's no good. This is a really simple procedure. It's just a matter of heating the steel up and then rubbing it with a brush. Just make sure you do clean the steel first. If it's the bolt, make sure you really wire brush it, get all the coating off, and then put it in some acetone, make sure it's nice and clean. Heat it up, rub it with a brush, and just keep going and keep going. You don't have to get it too hot. It'll just work and you'll see it start to transform. And I think the more you do it, the better the coating will be. I'm filming with my phone at the moment inside the house because for some reason it's not showing up on the camera that I normally use with the lighting in the garage. But as you can see, it's come up really nice. If you compare the actual thread with the head, you can see how much difference there is. And there's so many applications you could use this for, not just bolts. Here's a comparison to everything that I've tried, and just keep in mind that I guess I was getting better as I was getting further into it. The vegetable oil was pretty good, it works, but I think once again, the heat being consistent with it as well as the quenching. Same with the WD-40, the second attempt, and that was the first attempt. It works okay, looks all right. This was the linseed oil, and I think that was probably the most consistent, not super dark. I think the WD-40 was still darker. This stuff was just rust guard. I mean, it gets rid of the rust, but it doesn't really do anything apart from that. Here we go with the black oil, and I don't really see that much difference with the black oil, to be honest. If I was to heat that up a lot more, I think it would work better. And this is the really cool 120 grit pattern that I had there. This one was the one that I heated up till it was cherry red and used WD-40, and it's probably come out the most consistent and the darkest. but the integrity of that bolt wouldn't be very good now, I don't think. This one was just WD-40, not too hot, just about 300 to 400 C, and this one was the linseed oil. And if you compare those side by side, I think that they're pretty damn similar. Can't really see too much of a difference. I think maybe the linseed oil has a bit more of a gloss to it, but yeah, I think they're pretty much similar. And with the other stuff that I tried, the stainless, I don't really see any point to doing that, but it kind of works. This came out really nice. Once again, it's probably a lot to do with the finish as well as the heating process and the quenching. The bolts, you really can't see how gold that is, but that came out pretty nice. And the other bracket came out pretty well as well. I actually learnt a lot and enjoyed that little experiment, so let me know in the comments which one's your favorite. If you've enjoyed this video, here's another two similar to this one. Go and check them out. Well, I just realized you can actually brass coat the stainless as well, and that looks really cool.